But the funny thing about my story is that it isn't really about me at all. It's about what God has done and is doing. I wonder if you were to think for a moment, if there was one word that God would use to describe you, what would that be? If I could choose any word in the English dictionary to capture my essence, I would want it to be something like, she's kind, or she's thoughtful, or maybe authentic, or generous, or reliable. But you see, the thing is that at my lowest, none of those were the words that God chose. Tenacious is probably the best word to describe me. I have tenacity. And for the scholars amongst us, this comes from the Latin teneo, which means to hold on, to grasp, to stretch. The sort of character that causes you to cling on for dear life with dogged determination, no matter what is going on around you. Kind of like Jacob when he was wrestling with God, like Abraham when he was trudging up the hill to sacrifice his son, like Hannah clinging on for the son and the life that God had promised her. To be tenacious is to make a commitment to endure and to not give up when it would be easier to give up, to not lose faith when everything around you is going completely and utterly wrong. Still with me? Great. When's the last time you were going through an incredibly difficult time and you, at your lowest point, were excited about clinging on for dear life? Yeah, that's what I thought, exactly. In times of trial and hardship, we want to escape. We want respite. We want favor. We want anything except what we are experiencing. And tenacity is a bit like a muscle that you have to cultivate and develop. It involves waiting and longing and patience. And kind of like going to the gym, it takes months and years of consistency to achieve an 8-pack. I don't care what Joe Wicks tells you on social media. But you see, the problem with tenacity is that unlike the gym, you haven't set the training plan. You don't know the frequency of your sessions, what obstacles you're going to face. You don't know which muscles you need to focus on. So you're uncomfortable all the time because you're trying to train everything. And I'll let you into a secret. I wasn't in a rush to hand over the training plan. I grew up in an environment that probably wasn't dissimilar to what many of you have experienced, living amongst undiagnosed mental health challenges, personality disorders, unstable finances, irregular routines, scarce resources, and the instability of moving a lot. Home was not a place either me or my brother wanted to be. It was a dysfunctional place of conflict. And while all of our material needs were satisfied most of the time, we just didn't really enjoy being at home. It was a place you had to survive in because there was a lot of anger, a lot of anxiety, and a lot of manipulation and lies. And there were even more things that I didn't find out about until I learned my father was a spy. Anyway, by the time I was sent off to school, I was already in extreme survival mode. But as a child, I was afraid. I needed to be protected, and instead I was neglected and abandoned. Fast forward, growing up too early and left to my own devices, I became an ambitious, fearful, insecure, neurotic lawyer in crisis. And in my 20s and my 30s, I careened between immigration woes, to my mother being arrested at regular intervals, and pouring myself into my work to hold trauma at bay. I focused on overachieving to quieten the voices in my head, and let me tell you, all I wanted was green pastures. I distinctly remember a conversation with my then vicar in 2017, where I was just scratching the surface on what is post-traumatic stress. It's before I had a breakdown, before I was fired from my high-flying legal job for my Christian faith, and before God intervened by flinging a wrecking ball across the remaining parts of my life that I thought were still intact. I said to my vicar, referring to Psalm 1, that God said that he promised that his children are like trees planted in streams of living water, but I felt like a parched tree. I couldn't find refreshment. Just FYI, Crisis is really, really good at concealing all the ways that God is at work to redeem our story. But I was so embarrassed of who I was, of how I'd gotten to where I was. of the fact that I didn't know where I was going, and I had no idea who I was becoming. All I knew was that I needed respite and that it felt really, really far away. So, as Craig has read, today's passage reads, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul." Now, for those of you who do know me, you'll know that I'm quite committed to wrestling with things, wrestling with ideas, wrestling with problems, wrestling with anything that doesn't make sense. I'm equally committed to finding gold nuggets in uncomfortable places, even if I have to stay in those uncomfortable places for an uncomfortably long time. But I wrestled with verse 1. I was like, "Lord, what do you mean I lack nothing? You've promised me that I will be this tree. You've promised," verse 2, "that you'll make me lie down in green pastures, that you'll lead me beside quiet waters, that you'll refresh my soul." But I ain't seeing it, and I definitely feel lack. Guess what happened next? Absolutely nothing. Or so I thought. You see, God doesn't move like we move. His thoughts are not our thoughts. His ways are not our ways. I was so desperate to lie down in green pastures, I started envisaging what life could be like if I were to put my rose-tinted glasses on. I imagined the greenery of the Yorkshire Dales where I'd grown up, remembering it like a child and when I was at university. I imagined feeling at peace whilst frolicking around the countryside, like Maria and Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. I had a totally unrealistic view of what it would look like to be free of conflict and complexity and chaos. And I decided that what I thought these green pastures should be, and then got frustrated and disappointed and upset by the delta between those ideas and my experience of them. So frustrated, in fact, that I spent years working on an entire book to help me and others delight in Jesus and desire more of him. I couldn't understand where those elusive green pastures were, and there was no abatement of the crises around me. But slowly, surely, God was working through my wrestling to bring about something new, something I'd never experienced before. His focus was on dismantling my self-sufficiency, of dismantling the things in my heart that made it impossible for me to enjoy him. I was not ready for green pastures. First, I had to learn how to depend on God for provision, for life and breath and everything. I don't know if you remember, but when the Israelites were in the desert, in the time of the plagues, when God rained down manna from heaven, that manna would spoil if it was not consumed on that day. I'm not even joking. It took me 8 years from that original point to understand that I lack nothing. Not in a pseudo-spiritual, I have the Lord on my side and I have his infinite resources at my disposal, but in that I really have been given everything that I need for life and breath and everything. Okay, brief but vulnerable deep dive. 3 months ago, my liabilities exceeded my assets. Officially, probably could have sold my car, but satisfied the definition of bankruptcy. And it really forced me to wrestle with this idea of I lack nothing. Because the thing is, God holds our provision in his hands. He knows what tomorrow will bring, and therefore he is best placed to provide for today. In that season, I was living hour by hour, powerless, beyond anxious, patiently waiting to see what God was going to do. So much was changing. It was clear that he was at work, but unclear what he was going to do about it. And sometimes we have reckonings with God where we question his faithfulness. This was one of them, a make or break for my faith. But what was different about this saga was I stopped wrestling. I made difficult decisions. I put my hands up. I repented of mistakes I knew I had made. I took a nap. And I said, I will lie down because you are faithful. I am yours. And either you see me in my distress and do something about it, or you will let me expire and I will wait for further instructions. Lovely people, it was in the place where I was waiting for God to show up that I had the experience of the green pastures. And it was not what I thought it would feel like. It was the experience of waiting on God to provide just enough for today. Not to get fanciful ideas about how I was going to get through tomorrow, but about having total peace about the sufficiency of God's provision for today. By nature, we always want more than we need. An extra slice of cake, a Peloton rather than a second-hand racing road bike, a designer jumper rather than one from Sainsbury's. But God is kind, and he wasn't punishing me by allowing me to be in an inescapable situation with no way out except by his grace. Green pastures are about depending on God and valuing the daily bread he provides. Not to begrudge the provision or to devalue it so that it spoils. And as it happens, God was really busy doing immeasurably more than all I could ask or imagine. He really pulled it out of the bag at the 11th and a half hour. But on a human level, it was strikingly simple. Learning to trust God, to work things out in his way and in his timing, one day at a time. He's not in a rush. Learning to believe in his steadfast and unfailing love, and to allow the tenacity that he's been forging in me to be something that is channeled in step with his spirit, so that I go willingly where he is taking me, not where I want to go. It was never about money. It's still not about the money, but it was always about surrendering control. You see, green pastures don't look fancy or particularly inviting. They are seemingly random, but divinely orchestrated ways, places, spaces where God is redeeming your story. They are just enough for today. And those shoddy tufts that sprout up, that look like discarded seconds on a rack at TK Maxx, contain just the right nutrients and encouragements to meet our individualized needs for the moment. God draws us to what we need in a way that it could have only been him, unpicking our dreams and desires and making us fit for his heaven. The Good Shepherd, like he did for David, creates a safe place for us to enjoy his provision. It's safe simply because he is there in it with us. And it's there in those green pastures that he has designed, that he imprints on our hearts, so that we can go away from that place where we encounter him changed, different than we were before, living from that deeper, richer sense of God that we gained while we were there. Amen.